Well, it's good morning, everyone, and good afternoon to Dan from Las Vegas. I'd like to introduce Dan Heaton and Dan Heenan, who's giving our presentation for our December education morning for the New South Wales Association of Fire Investigators. Dan has been a big person in the fire investigation industry. He's been with the ATF for over 30 years before retiring. And now he works with Clark County Fire Department as an assistant fire chief. He's done a lot of stuff in the fire investigation industry. To mention a few, he's currently the chair of the Nfpa 1033 technical committee, and he's also been a past president of the International Association of Arson Investigators. He's an IAAI CFI, he's an ATF CFI, as well as an IAAI chief instructor, certified instructor, I should say. And he's also been the chair for the CFItrainer.net committee as well. So he's a very busy man, and we do appreciate his time this morning. And this morning, he's going to talk about the changes to Nfpa 1033, which is the standard for professional qualifications for fire investigator. And the new edition has come out this year, the 2022 edition, and he's going to talk about the changes from the 2014 edition. Thank you, Dan, for your time this morning, and it's over to you.
Great, thank you. Thank you very much. Thanks for having me. Thanks for inviting me. I don't normally like instructors that apologize right up front, but I'm going to do that. I've never done a Zoom. I've done lots of Zoom, but never where I was presenting. So if I start speaking too quickly, or you don't understand what I'm saying, or my accent is too odd, just put something in the chat and I can explain what we're talking about. We're also going to be talking about really a very boring and dry document. So there's not like a lot of videos, there's not any fire videos or anything like that. So I apologize. I normally don't like to put a lot of words on the page, but on a screen, but that's what's going to happen. Like was said earlier, I'm currently the assistant fire chief here in Clark County Fire Department. It's a fire department that oversees the entire Las Vegas Strip, and then about 4,700 square miles outside of that. I was brought over from ATF just to run the fire investigation division. So I'm still law enforcement. Our fire investigators here are all law enforcement. So we still effect arrest, do origin and cause, and such. So what I thought I'd do is I'm going to touch base on 1033. I don't really know how much you guys rely on 1033 over there.
Yeah, if I could say that it's probably not a well-known document here in Australia. Obviously, it's a standard for the US, but we don't have a standard here in Australia. So, yeah, I guess it's a bit hard for you to explain. But I guess one of the reasons for asking you to come onto our Zoom and explain to the people here in Australia is just, I guess, the importance from your perspective. And I think certainly what the US does in fire investigation industry is important to what Australia should be doing. So I guess, yeah, if you want to explain that.
Sure. So we have the National Fire Protection Association puts out different documents in the United States, and they put out two really different types. There's a standard and a guide. And a standard is something that prescribed that you must follow, you have to adhere to. So in that, and I'll talk about that in presentation a little bit, but in that you're going to see the word shall a lot, like you shall do this, you shall do something else. Then a guide, and you're probably more familiar because it is the better known document, NFPA 921 is the guide for fire investigation. And that's really the how-to book. One of the misnomers about 1033, it's the standard, but it's the standard for professional qualifications. So it's not what you have to do at every single scene, because every single scene is so different. But these are the basic standards that every fire investigator in the United States should comport with to be accepted and to be minimally qualified. And that's the key phrase here, minimally qualified. Obviously, just by covering the basics, that doesn't mean you're at the top of your field. As anybody that's been doing this for a long time knows, hopefully you feel like you're never at the top of your field and you're always striving to learn more as as our understanding of the physics of fire change. So that's what 1033 is. It sounds like much like in Australia, 921 is what most fire investigators, even here in the United States, readily speak about, and very few talk about 1033 and the minimum qualifications. So that's what I was asked to talk about. 1033, I think it's important, and I'll be saying this throughout the presentation. The two documents mirror, or not mirror, but they integrate really well. So 1033 will say, here's the qualification that your person has to know. And then 921 will explain, okay, here's how you do that. So these two are very compatible, and they work really well in tandem together. Okay, let me see if I can move this. Okay. There we go. So the purpose of the presentation, like I kind of said, is to talk about the 1033 and really talk about the changes that are in effect on the 2020 edition. So this is the new edition that's come out. It's actually, and that's a mistypo right there, it's a 2022 edition. So even though this document was released just last year or a few months ago, we're still calling it the 2022 edition, and that's more administrative reasons. We're combining a number of different standards together, and we're now all on a 5-year cycle. So this is just to make the administrative life easier, but this is going to be the 2022 edition. One thing I have to say is I am chairman of this this document. This presentation is mine and mine alone. This presentation doesn't represent the thoughts and plans of NFPA 921. As we'll speak about, it's a consensus document, so not everybody in the room agrees with everything. These are my interpretations as a member, not even as chair. So when I speak of something or when I make a comment, those are mine and mine alone. That's something we're mandated to put up in there. So before we begin, this is really, really important in the United States. I don't know if you guys have heard of this document over there, but a few years ago in 2004, the United States looked at our forensic sciences, and they didn't just look at fire investigation, which was considered a forensic science, but they looked at fingerprinting and odontology and tool mark comparisons. And what they found is that in the United States, at least, we did a very poor job in our forensic sciences. We had information about forensic sciences. We had all this data, but we really relied on what the previous generation taught us, and there's very little science to back up what we were talking about. So this thing was put out by the Department of Justice, the United States Department of Justice, and they brought these scientists together, and they found out that at least in the United States, we do a pretty bad job at this. So this was the catalyst for really pushing forward certifications, accreditation, and standards. So that's kind of the genesis of where this came. They said that there is a massive lack of standardization from one lab to another or from one agency to another. So they suggested that nationwide, we identify what these are, identify our standards, agree on a standard, and then agree on a certification to that standard.
I could just say, Dan, yeah, we just did have John Lentini actually come on last month and just talk about OSAC and the report that came out this year and stuff like that. So yeah, we're sort of aware of what's happening in the US.
Oh, good.
And again, trying to find out what's happening in the US, I think, is important for what could happen in Australia.
Well, that's really good. And I apologize to anybody that was listening to John on behalf of the United States. But no, I love John. He's very good, very good at what he does. But that helps me because I was going to go a little more into this, and I can fly by that.
Yeah,
and
that's fine.
By the OSAC stuff.
Yep.
So there are certifications in the United States, and you have some of those over there. I know you have the IAAI CFI that you can. Is NFPA over there? Is that something you guys have over there?
Yeah, certainly some people have got the CFEI certification. I think it's about 9 or 10 in Australia.
And then I don't know if they do it over there, but we have states could give you out a certification. Like I live in the state of Nevada, and there's a state certification. And then the federal government through ATF gave me a certification. So there's a lot of different ways to get certifications. I have my own personal beliefs about which certifications may be better than the others. But at the end of the day, I think the important thing is just to have a certification, because it puts you one step forward to proving your professionalism within our business. So regardless of my personal philosophies, as long as you begin to get certified in some manner, I think that's really going to help you identify yourself as a professional. One of the things they did talk about specifically about fire investigation, there was very little written in there, but they talk about, and I underlined this, but the paucity of research. So what they've said is that we really don't have much research. For instance, I'll use clean burn. Everybody kind of knows what clean burn is and what it means, but really what does it mean? Where are all the tests? Where are the hundreds or thousands of tests that have done to determine what the radiant heat flux on something is, or what when clean burns occurs, or how it occurs? We teach classes about it. We hand it down from generation to generation, but there's not much supporting scientific data. And I'm not saying clean burn doesn't mean anything, because I utilize it all the time. But what is the scientific data to support that? And maybe we need, as a worldwide field, need to identify that better and maybe do better research. It recommended sweeping reforms, but if John talked about all this, I'm going to move kind of past this. But really just, they want people certified and they want people to do more research in the field.
Yeah.
So let's talk about 1033 specifically. It's a standard for professional qualifications. And I can't emphasize that enough, that it's the standard for the qualifications. A lot of times here in the United States, we'll have attorneys try to beat you up on the witness stand that, well, in section or chapter 4, 4.3.7, they say this. Why aren't you doing that? Well, I'm qualified to do that. I know how to do that. But in this case and circumstance, this investigation didn't warrant that I do that. It's just like 921. You'll never use 921. I live in the middle of a desert. I don't do boat fires that often in the middle of the desert. So for me, the boat fire, the marine fire, it has very little merit. So if a defense attorney were to ask me, okay, 3 kids died in that house fire, what is the fiberglass hull melt at? That has nothing to do with what my fire is. So the same could be held true for 1033. So if you ever get beat up with that on a witness stand as a professional expert, then you'll be able to answer that these are just the minimum qualifications that I had to establish. That kind of covers what I just said. But the book does work really in tandem with 921. So 921 has various chapters that really get into meat and potatoes. And I do want to say, and this is a big belief I have, NFPA in 1033 relies on 921 a lot. And 921 is a very, very, very good book. It's probably one of the best books I've ever read related to fire investigation. But it's not the end all and be all, and doesn't have every answer. There are other treatises out there that are equally as competent as this one, and you should utilize as many as you can that answer your question. So Kirk's Fire Investigation, Lentini's book, there's a bunch of different books out there that do really, really well and talk about it. It's just not 921. It's just that that's the basis, and it's tied into 1033 nicely. So there is a difference between being qualified and being competent. And qualified is what we're looking at in 1033. What's the minimum qualifications? So you can adhere and meet every minimum qualifications, and that really doesn't mean that you're competent. So competency is totally different. And people sometimes think that, okay, I can be tested to all the qualifications 1033, so now I'm a competent fire investigator. But that competency comes through years of experience, ongoing training, research, and just your knowledge base and education. So there is just a big difference between the two. So being qualified means you officially, according to the dictionary, recognized as being trained to perform a particular job. And that's what every one of us should be, whether it's through on-hands training through your department, or whether it's through outside training through the IAAI or other organizations. That's how you become qualified. Oh, I'm going backwards. Sorry about that. That made no sense. I got lost for a second. Now, competency means having the necessary ability, knowledge, or skills to do something successfully. So again, one of the JPRs in, and that's a job performance requirement in 1033, is how to do a presentation. So you have to be able to present your findings to somebody else. And that doesn't mean you can do it well. We've all had somebody explain a case to us, and you seem to be more lost after the explanation than before. Well, he's qualified to give the presentation, but he's not very competent at doing it. So the two don't absolutely marry together. And the minimum qualification are what we're going to be talking about today. So a little history. The NFPA started doing technical committees for the National Fire Protection Association in 1972. Originally, they just had 4 what we call professional qualification documents. And they were for firefighter, fire officer, fire service instructor. And then oddly enough, fire inspector and fire investigator were combined together. So that was one document. So in 1972, those are the 4 initial documents. In 77, they started talking about separating the fire investigator and fire prevention officers and fire investigators. And in 1987, they did. They created NFPA 1033 for the first time. So it took 15 years for them to separate us out from fire inspectors. Then in 1990, they established the technical committee for this, and that's the committee that I sit upon right now. This book right now, the document we're talking about, it was issued by the Standards Council on May 28th of this year, and it has effective date of June 17th. And what that means is that all preceding documents don't really exist. They still exist to compare and contrast, but this one supersedes all these documents. And this is the document we should be using from now on moving forward. So real quick about how we come to these decisions on what's included in the book. We have 27 members on the committee, which is about, in my opinion, about 20 too many. It's just so hard to manage 27 people, especially with a lot of the attitudes people have about what they know and what they don't know. But we want to try to represent various segments of the fire investigation community as thoroughly as we can and completely as we can. So in our committee, we have 9 representatives that are users. So these are people that will use the document on a daily basis. And these are normally your fire investigators or your cops or something of that nature. We have no consumers because we don't create a consumable product. Special experts, we have 9 of those. Those are your, that's John Lentini. That's Dave Ico. Well, Dave Ico's not on the committee anymore. But those are your special private investigators that have an expertise in the matter, and they bring a different perspective than maybe a public service person that's a user. We have 1 manufacturing representative. We have 2 representatives from insurance companies. So major insurance companies have a stake in what fire investigators do and what the minimum qualifications are. Installer, maintainer isn't represented on ours, nor is labor. And then enforcement. These are people that enforce it. That would be ATF in our country and other agencies like that. So and we have 1 testing and research place. So what we try to do is not have 27 people for one group. Try to spread those groups out as much as possible so that all fields of communication and all fields of endeavor have an equal say in what's happening in that boardroom. These are the people. I'm not going to go over who these people are. There's a number of these people, if you know these names, that in the United States at least are very well known in the United States, have been doing it for many years. It does take years to get on the committee. We get a request to be on this committee dozens a year, and there's a massive waiting list. We don't have to add anybody by seniority, so whoever's waited the longest gets on. But if we were to lose a special expert, we go to a special expert group and see who's on there, or who's been doing something relevant in the field of fire investigation. So those are the committee people right now. Like I said, well, I didn't say this, but there's 8 public agencies represented. So that's 8 fire departments or police departments that have fire investigators. That's really that's my group that I kind of represent when I wasn't the chairman. 14 private agencies, and those are private insurance companies. We also have one university representative. That's Greg Gorbert from Eastern Kentucky University, but he also works as a special expert. So he's actually listed as a special expert. And then we have representatives. We have one from IAAI, we have one from Nfpa, we have one from ATF, and we have one from the National Electrical Manufacturers Association. Those aren't reserved spots, but we have one from each of those. We have since the existence of this document, just to have consistency, because those are kind of the people that oversee where our field of endeavor is going. And then we have the National Fire Academy here, and we have a representative that comes in from the National Fire Academy that doesn't vote. And the reason for that is, as we change these minimum qualifications, if we were to change something dramatically or drastically, they're probably going to have to change their teaching curriculum to reflect that. So we want them involved when they're setting the national training standards, so that they're in tandem with what we're doing. Oh, went backwards again. Sorry about that. Again, we're on a 5-year cycle. So the 2022 edition came out. The next edition will be the 2027. We are not in a revision cycle right now. So we'll start our revision cycle in probably 2 years out. So probably 2025. And I'm going to go over that revision cycle, because anybody anywhere can take part in these revisions. So when you're looking at 921 or you're looking at 1033, and there's something you disagree with, or there's something that you think we're missing, then you can submit a proposal and it'll be weighed as equally as anyone else's. We have a wildland fire here, but from what I understand, you guys have a massive wildland fire there. You may have better experts on wildland fire than we do. So we may be behind the power curve with what you already know exists. So you may be reading some of the chapters that relate to fire dynamics related to fire growth in wildland fires. And you may say, hey, you guys are missing the boat. You guys aren't seeing A, B, and C, or you're seeing A, B, and C, but you haven't seen G, H, and F. So something to think about. Everybody sees different things wherever you're located.
Just a question I had, Dan. The last edition was 2014. What was the reason, I guess, for the time? You say 5-year cycle, but it was a bit longer for the last one.
Yeah, they combined all these documents. They realized, as everybody wants a new document about a new standard or a new guide, it was massive. They all of a sudden started having hundreds and hundreds of documents. Well, the Nfpa has technical committee advisors, and they were being stretched too thin. So what they started doing is they started taking like maybe 7 or 8 documents that are somewhat related and putting them all under one general document and bringing the little ones underneath it. So I don't have an example, because our document was left alone once they saw what we do. They were talking about combining us with like the state fire marshals and maybe fire inspectors again. But by the time we finished having a conversation with them, they realized that we need to be left alone. But during that process, they weren't sure we were going to be left alone. So they were doing some administrative stuff, trying to streamline. We got left alone. But yes, we went quite a while, like 6 years, 8 years without a new document.
Okay.
So this is the iterative process. So I'm going to break it down in a second, but we start with can you see the cursor if I move that?
Yes, we can.
So the public input stage, what we'll do initially is we'll say, okay, it's open for public input, and you can go online and put a public input, like, I don't like this line, or I think we're missing this, and you can add something or delete something or change something. For instance, one time, one of the proposals I recommended years ago was, they said the maximum radiant heat flux ever identified in a compartment fire was like 85 kilowatts per meter squared. Well, I had seen research where, when you get a ventilation pattern and you get a flow path, you have upwards of 180 kilowatts per meter squared. So that was just misinformation that we had not understood, because we didn't have the capability maybe to measure that accurately. So just a simple change of that to make sure that we're keeping up with our understanding of science. But it could be anything in the document that you disagree with. Now, I will say this, just because you submit a proposal doesn't mean it's accepted. I've had, unfortunately, the vast majority of mine are not accepted. And then I resubmit it and maybe gets accepted on a second or third time. So it's a iterative process that you sometimes just have to keep doing. The second step is the public comment. So once we get the initial input, then our committee will come together, we'll vote on it, and then we'll put out what we believe our votes are, or what we believe the new document should look like. And then everybody has an opportunity to then make a second stab at it. Like, well, John Joe said he wanted to add this and you accepted that, but that shouldn't be in there for the following reasons, because now it's almost a whole new document. So that's the next process. Step 3, well, the step 3 and 4, I'm going to break it down right here. So step 1, that's a 1 to 2 year revision cycle. Public input comes in, first draft is by the committee, then we ballot it. So when we're in the room and we're debating these things, we get like thumbs up, thumbs down, not really, but we have votes on every single input put in by anybody. So somebody says, hypothetically, that should be a semicolon, not a comma. We do get those every once in a while. We all vote. Does anybody believe it should be a comma? Does anybody? And then we pass that. But then you get to the issues like we'll talk about thermometry. Thermometry was taken out of the document. So there was a large debate about why should that be left in or why should it be left out, because now you're changing potentially some of the more important elements of the document. So that was left out. We need 2/3 to approve it. So if something's added or deleted, 2/3 of the committee have to approve that. And then everybody goes home, everybody takes a breath, and then they send out the ballots, and then we all have to vote again. So maybe there was peer pressure, maybe you changed your mind, maybe somebody sent you some information that you weren't aware of. But once that ballot is reported, then the first draft of the document comes out. Once that comes out, again, public comments come out, everybody sends their comments in, and then we have a second draft and we talk about all the comments. Okay, I remember in 921, there was something they put out and like 80% of the comments were negative. So they said, well, obviously we believe in this room that it's right, but if 80% of the people submitting comments believe it's wrong, maybe we missed something. So let's leave it out because it's that contentious. Again, 2/3 vote and it moves forward for a second ballot. At that point, it's done on the input side and it goes to the technical committee. That's the big dogs, and they approve it or don't approve it. There's some other stuff, NIDMAMs, I'm not going to get into, but there's ways to try to block it. It's kind of like a filibuster. Very rarely happens, but there are possibilities that could happen. Once everything's done, though, then they issue the document and it becomes the document, supersedes all previous documents, and then moves forward. So let me tell you a big change that happened for all of NFPA, one that I'm livid about personally. I've written letters, I've written emails, but they no longer issue an electronic copy of any single document. I personally live with electronic copies because I can word search. If I'm looking for spontaneous combustion, I can put the word spontaneous in, find it anywhere in the document, reference that, see if it meets what I'm looking for. I think they're believing people are sharing these electronic copies too often. So you cannot buy that at all. What you can do is buy a hard copy. So this is the new hard copy. It's actually very thin. It's not a big document. Whereas the document for 921 is massively thick. You can buy these hard copies, or you can get, you could join NFPA Link, which gives you access to all the documents. And it's $9.99 a month or $40.49. You can see the prices there. So I'm hoping people push back on this. I'm hoping people complain about this because I don't think it's the best answer. I know from a monetary point of view, economically, they don't want it, but it doesn't help us in the field. I do carry a 921 with me, but when you're digging, anybody that's digging a fire scene or out in the middle, as you're digging through that document, you're smearing pages, you're ripping and tearing. If I can have, during my break, have an electronic copy when I'm eating my lunch away from the scene, go get onto my computer and do a technical search of an electronic copy just helps so much. So
yeah, we certainly were aware of that. And last year, I told everyone about that, and I certainly wrote a letter saying, that's wrong. It makes our job a bit harder, but obviously they've stayed their line and they're trying to make the money.
yeah, that's what they do.
Mm.
So again, this is a consensus document. As you saw, it takes 2/3 majority to pass or cut anything out. I would say it's very, very rare that everybody in the room agrees. So I actually use that when I testify. When somebody says, isn't it true that 921 says this? I said, yeah, but it's a consensus document. I don't know for a fact that everybody agreed to that. As a matter of fact, I wrote something that disagreed with that. So I recommended a change. I just disagree with the document. It's a good document, but I disagree with it. So I think that's important to remember, that a consensus document means not everybody agrees to what's in there, and it's just the majority rules, and it gets put in. I have every copy of 921 that ever existed, so I can go back and show where 921 earlier editions refute the current edition. And some of that's based on our understanding of science, but some of it's based on the changing boardroom, where people will add different people, maybe they vote different ways. So something to always remember, consensus document doesn't mean it's the word of God handed down. When you do look at these documents, if there was a revision, on the column outside of it, if they deleted a text, they put that little triangle type thing. If a whole section is deleted, they put that little circle, and new material is now shaded, meaning a revision, and has an N next to it. So that's really important, especially with the big documents like the National Electric Code for our country and NFPA 921. If you just want to look at what are the changes, what changed in the document, you can go through and just look at those subtle changes, makes your life a lot easier. Again, NFPA is really important, and the standards are really important in our country. So these are what regulate our industry. Everything in here says shall, you will do this, you shall do this. Again, they started with 4 back in 1972, and now they have 25. So some of them are like they broke apart fire investigator and fire inspector, which were one, but they've also added things. Plans checker has one. There's just a whole bunch. PIO, public information officer, trainer, all these have standards now to try to follow, so that nationally we're doing the same thing as everybody else, and we can try to have some consistency in our training and our at least minimum qualifications. There is a new one coming out that's coming out next. Well, we don't know when it's coming out. It's 1321, and that's going to be a fire investigation unit standard, and that's going to tell us, that one's out for review right now. So if any of you manage an FIU or any of you are in a fire investigation unit, a fire investigation unit's defined as 1 person to 50, 100 people, however many you have. So even the sole practitioner is considered to be part of a FIU, even if it's just he or she. So I would recommend, well, at least in the United States, I've recommended everybody's going through and looking at the standard. I'm on that committee as well, being on the 1033, and I have a lot of major heartaches. I run an FIU here. Some of the things they've added into their, I don't think are realistic in how an FIU can run. I don't think financially you can afford to do what they're talking about doing. So that's another editorial thing. That's not NFPA talk about that. Again, it creates a standard across the country, and starting to see other countries look at this. Like you guys are having a class on it. I know the UK has classes on it. I know Canada does a lot in this, and so is South America now looking at NFPA standards as maybe creating their standard for their nation. So I think it would just make fire investigation easier. And I'm not saying the United States has all the answers. So maybe a standard over in the UK would be a better standard than what we have. If we can look at that standard, if you had one, then we could say, well, let's take that component of it and let's get rid of some of our components. I just think that the world's becoming too small not to all work together toward a common goal. So I think that's what NFPA is hoping to do down the road. by embracing other countries and sharing our documents with other countries. I think the most important thing for 1033, and I'll mention this a couple of times, it's the minimum qualifications. So it's a great way to set up your training for your FIU or for your fire investigation or association. One thing we do here, we're going to talk about Chapter D or Appendix D in a minute. Appendix D has massively changed. We used to have this section in 1033 called 1.3.7 that listed 16 topics that you had to be well versed in order to render an opinion. We've taken that out and we've added even more, unfortunately, or fortunately, it depends on how you look at it. But this is a great way to do training, much like you guys are doing here. Our chapter in Nevada, we do what we call lunch and learn. So every other month we get together and we either all bring lunch, or one of the private guys or one of the board up companies or one of the insurance companies buys everybody lunch. And we come together and we take a topic off of that list and we have ongoing training. For instance, we just did the ideal gas law training last time, which we'll talk about when we get the appendix. And we brought a chemist in from our forensic lab, and he talked about how the ideal gas law relates to fire investigation and our understanding of pressure and volume and how gases migrate, how smoke migrates and stuff like that. Well, then we say we had ongoing training on this topic. So I think that's what this document, more than anything else, will provide you, is kind of a course outline on what training you may need, what gaps you may have in your understanding of fire investigation as it is. Again, I cannot emphasize enough that 1033 and 921 go hand in hand. They are sister documents. 1033 might say you, in order to be minimally qualified, you have to know how to interpret fire patterns. You have to understand how to interpret fire effects. Well, what does that mean? That's all it really says. Well, then you go to 921, you go to Chapter 6, fire effects and fire patterns, and you understand what the 16 fire effects are, how energy is absorbed by the different materials as it's positioned there, and what happens during that absorption. Do we have melting? Do we have charring? Do we have mass loss? Do we have a combination of all that? All that is outlined in 921. So 1033 says minimally qualified, you have to understand fire effects. But if you want to understand fire effects, you go to Chapter 6 of 921, and it's laid out right there, all the stuff that you'll be looking for. So it's a how-to book more than anything else. It tells you how to do the investigation. Kind of same thing I said. So let's talk about NFPA 1033. It's really a short document. It has 4 chapters. And of the 4 chapters, Chapter 2 is like almost non-existent. It's just reference publications, and there's like 5 or 6. So it's a very, very, very short document. But again, it outlines what you have to do in the United States to be minimally qualified. So in the previous document, 2014, there were 3 annexes. There was the explanatory material annex, and we still have that in this document. There was an explanation of what a JPR, that's a job performance requirement. So that's, in order to do that job, you have to be formed at this level, and what are the requirements you have to demonstrate to do that. So we call those JPRs. So that existed in both documents as in the same. We added an overview of JPRs for fire investigators because people are trying to take, I can't really give you a good example, but some JPRs that were in the other documents, and it didn't relate really to fire investigators. So Annex C now outlines a couple of JPRs as it relates to fire investigators. So maybe it's a little easier to understand how a JPR relates to you. Annex D is going to be the one that we're going to get the most comments about. It's going to have the most discussion. It's a game changer. Anybody that's familiar with NFPA 1033 before, 1.3.7 were the 16 topics. And those used to get debated and argued about all the time. We removed that, but we put in Annex D. And Annex D now has, unfortunately or fortunately, depending on how you look at it, like 50 topics. And we'll go over what those are. I'm not going to go in depth. Again, you'll see when I'm talking about how you outline your training, how specific some of these topics are. But that's good when you're identifying a training program. And then Annex E's informational references, which is the previous like Annex C. So that's some changes. We'll get to each one of those in the middle. We did do an entire rewrite of Chapter 1, the administration chapter. We didn't change too much. Other than 1.3.7 and 1.3.8, which I'll talk about. What we did is we combined a lot of it and just made it consistent with all the other NFPA documents. Remember earlier I said one of the reasons we took 8 years to come out with this document is because they were combining all these documents together. One of the things NFPA wanted to do is they wanted everybody's Chapter 1 to be very similar. Obviously, some of the minimum qualifications are going to be different, but you should be able to look in 1.3.8 and that's your minimum quals in every document. So that took some time for them to figure out, and that's really why Chapter 1 was rewritten to its entirety. It didn't change too much. A lot of the information that was in there before is still in there. Like I said, very few things were changed, and if they were changed, they were really just moved to maybe another chapter. And I'll explain what I'm talking about in a minute. So the scope of this standard shall, you're going to see that word a lot, identify the minimum job performance requirements for investigators. So this is what an investigator should have to be able to prove that he or she could do to minimally prove that they're a fire investigator. We'll go through each of these. Annex A, some of the, if there's an asterisk next to like 1.1 and there's an asterisk, that means you go to the annex and there's some explanatory information back there. So in the United States, we had pushback from wildland fire investigators who said that 1033 and 921 don't relate to us. We do something totally different. We do wildland fires, and wildland fires are totally different than compartment fires. Whereas there can be a philosophical debate about that. The physics of fire, the chemistry of fire, radiant heat flux, the thermodynamics of fires are the same regardless of where that fire is. Now, in a compartment fire, do you have the upper gas layer developed much closer, and then you have radiant heat flux radiating downward throughout the room? Yes. Do you have that in wildland fire? No, because the heat goes upwards. But you may have in wildland fires that you're catching a canopy, a tree canopy on fire that then radiates heat downward. So there was a lot of pushback, and the committee, this is years ago, really wanted to emphasize that this document in the United States is for all fire investigators. So the intent of this standard applies to all fire investigators, including outside wildland, vehicle, and structure fires. Regardless of what type of fire you're investigating in the United States, this document applies to you. And that's a very key component of what this document's purporting to be. It also says that this is for private and public investigators. This document just isn't for a public sector fire investigator who works for a fire department. If you're a private fire investigator, you also are overseen by this document. So that's in there, public and private. So basically all fire investigators in the United States. It says that when you do evaluations of your job performance job, that you should have somebody evaluating you who is qualified. The authority having jurisdiction makes that determination on who's qualified. But what we are seeing in the United States is that you may have somebody in your chain of command, you're a fire investigator, who gets promoted to be your supervisor, who's never investigated a fire in his or her life. Now, they may be totally capable of reviewing your report from an administrative and grammatical standpoint, but are they going to understand radiant heat flux? Are they going to understand what the first fuel ignited, how that led to the second fuel ignited? If they can't understand that, how are they going to be able to ask you whether your hypothesis is valid? How are they going to be able to refute and ask you questions about how do you explain this? Or you mentioned this, but you never looked at this hypothesis. How did you rule and eliminate that? So we wanted people to understand that the people doing at least a technical review of your report should be at least as competent as you and have the same or greater certification if they can. So we put that in there. That's actually been in there the last one, but I just wanted to really put that out there because it's really important that people who are doing a technical review be capable of doing that technical review and aren't just an administrative person in that job for 6 to 8 months. So in a new document, like I said, it's kind of essentially the same. We left that in both documents. It was in the previous one, changed some of the wordage a little bit in the new document, but we didn't change the meaning or intent of the document. So still, if someone's doing your review, they may be able to do a grammatical one, but they can't do a technical one of your document unless they know what they're talking about. So the general requirements under 1.3.1 were moved. They're still the same. They were combined and moved to the latter part of the chapter. In the United States, you have to be 18 years of age. You can't be a fire investigator 16. You have to have a high school diploma or equivalent. We have something here called a GED, a graduate equivalency diploma, where you can sit for a test. Maybe you didn't go all the way through high school, but you sit for the test and show you have the requisite knowledge. That counts as that same educational requirement. But if you don't have either one of those, you can't be a fire investigator. And you have to have a background investigation done on you by the people in authority having jurisdiction to make sure you're not a felon or anything like that. So those are our minimums. These all still exist and the new document just moved. We added these two, that the authority having jurisdiction. And when we talk about authority having jurisdiction, that just means whoever's in charge, your municipality, your state government, your private boss, if he or she, if you work for a private entity, they have to provide the necessary personal protective equipment. We really, in NFPA, we're really pushing for safety, especially in fire investigations. A lot of people think that, once the fire trucks leave, the scene's safe now, but we all know, we've been doing this a while, that the off-gassing is the hydrogen cyanide of the plastics and the carbon monoxide and carbon dioxide of a lot of the chemicals continues for days. So as you start digging around and start changing things, if you're not wearing proper respiratory protection, if you're not wearing proper gear, you're not being very safe. So the authority having jurisdiction, whether that's your boss in the private side or whether it's your chief in the public sector, he or she is responsible for ensuring that you have that. And you're supposed to wear those things whenever you're doing any job where you're going to be coming in contact with those biohazards, and not biohazards, but just hazards. I've talked about this before, but 1.3.7, which was a Sweet 16, were removed, as was 1.3.8, which basically said you have to remain current on these topics by attending formal education. So they were removed. But were they really? And what we did is the administrative chapter wasn't really, in our opinion, where they should be. They should be under the JPR. So chapter 4, which is the job performance requirements. So we moved them under the job performance requirements, and then we expanded them, and we expanded them greatly in the annex. So we'll get there in a minute. They're going to be in chapter D, but we just moved into section 4.1, which is the JPR section. Continuing on to public reference publications, I said this is just a tiny little change. We just referenced some other NFPA documents in this document. Really nothing other than that's a good reference if you want to learn more. Really no critical change there. We did add some definitions. These definitions, these three were in the old document. I just put them out. If you're not familiar with NFPA documents, I'm not going to read you this slide, but shall versus should. Shall is a standard, should is a guide. A should is a best practice, basically, and then tells you what a standard is. I've kind of beat that up, so I'm going to move past this slide. We did add new definitions for explosion dynamics, failure analysis, fire chemistry, fire. You can read these. I'm not going to read you the definition. You can go into that section, but there were 7 new definitions added to the document. So now we get to the meat of the document. The real meat of the document is chapter 4. That's the fire investigator section, and it's broken into 7 different sections. So each of these sections is important. 4.1 is kind of the general section, and we'll go over that a little bit. And then 4.2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and 7 really didn't change too much. A big change came in 4.1, and that's really going to affect the document and where we're going. So let's go into them. So basically 4.1, the very first thing it says is you shall meet all the JPRs in 4.2, 4.7. So this is the general requirement. You must be able to do 4.2 and 4.7 in order to be qualified, minimally qualified as a fire investigator. And again, we'll get to what those are in a second. However, it's not it is not logical. This is in the annex that you have to train your people and show their performance necessarily in the order that they were given. So you can develop your own training regimen. You can say, I'm going to teach report writing before I teach fire effects. I don't know why you'd ever do that, but maybe you decided we're going to do that. And that's fine. We don't care in what order you teach these skill sets. But at the end of the day, all the skill sets should be mastered. Really important one, I think, 4.1.2 in the United States, all fire investigators shall employ all the elements of the scientific method as the operating analytical process throughout the investigation and for the drawing of conclusions. I normally don't read a slide. I hate people that read slides to me, but this is really, really important. So we rely on the scientific method. If you go into the annex, they document what the scientific method is. We thought it was important enough to include in this document. But if you go to chapter 4 of 921, which is the methodology chapter, it outlines exactly how the scientific method is utilized. Not only that, the people in 921, that committee thought it important enough that in chapter 18, the origin chapter, and chapter 19, the cause chapter, they then again listed the scientific method as to determining origin, and then subsequently, once you have that identified, how to determine cause. So this is very important. In the United States, if you were to say, I didn't rely on the scientific method, I don't know who would say that, you could be excluded and not be allowed to render an opinion in the United States. I don't know how that is on your end. I've never testified there, but.
Yeah, well, it's important, but unfortunately, it's not a sort of, you must do that. Certainly people give testimony in court and not talk about scientific method, and they're never challenged on it over here. So, but as I remind everyone, you could be challenged on it, so you should prepare for it. So,
well, and that's a really good point. I teach classes a lot here, and I would say 80% of the fire investigators in this country never get questioned on methodology either. But I always tell them, it's the day you do get testified on methodology and you didn't follow the methodology that you're going to wish you had. So by trying to stress it early on, then they can have that in the back. But here in the United States, the judge is the determinator as to whether something's admitted in a court of law or not. So regardless of what we put out there as a standard, the judge can say, yeah, I don't care, I'll allow it. So we kind of have that same thing here. So again, 921 chapter 4 lists a whole chapter on basic methodology, how to employ the scientific method. 4.1 says we also must conduct a safety assessment of the scene. So, and when you get to the scene, the first thing you must do is make sure that scene's safe. Can I go in there? Do I need additional tools? Do I need additional PPE? What do I need to make sure that I'm safe? You shall remain liaison with other professionals. That's so that you don't get left behind and you don't start believing everything you think. You start meeting with other professionals. You have ongoing discussions with them. You have to adhere to all the legal and regulatory requirements of the municipality or the jurisdiction you're acting upon or under. And you shall understand the incident management system. Here in the United States, we have ICS, Incident Command System. So when you get to a fire scene, the commander of the incident is still going to be in charge. You report to him, you fall in under him. And that's another portion of the safety aspect, so he's aware of who's on his scene. Okay, I won't use that one anymore. That's a little long. So 4.1.7 is the thing that we added. And this is going to be what I think we're going to have the most discussion, because it basically took the place of 1.3.7 earlier. So this is the requisite knowledge for what a fire investigator needs to know. This is a basic knowledge that we have to have an understanding about. And the question comes up is, what is requisite knowledge and how much is requisite? So we wanted to answer that question, and that's where we came. So
this is what I do.
There's 4 things, 4 sections, and then each section is then subdivided again into another section, another section, another section. So we decided the 4 sections are, you have to understand fire science, and that's broken down again. You have to understand fire investigation, and that's broken down. You have to understand fire scene safety and what that includes. And then you have to understand building systems. So under 4.1.7, they list these and then they break them down a little bit. Now, Annex D, like I keep alluding to, when we get there, you'll see that it really breaks it down a lot. So when they talk about fire science in this document, what are they talking about? So you need to have an understanding, requisite knowledge of fire chemistry, thermodynamics, fire dynamics, explosion dynamics. Again, 1.3.7 listed thermodynamics. Well, anybody that studied thermodynamics knows that, you know, there's basically the 3 laws of thermodynamics plus the 0th law. So could I get asked questions about entropy? Could I get asked questions about the 0th law? Would all of those come in if I have to understand thermodynamics? What the committee decided to do is further explain, when we're talking thermodynamics, let's create Annex D and let's talk about what thermodynamics means as it interrelates to fire investigation, because fire investigation is what, at the end of the day, what we're trying to determine. And I'll get there eventually. So fire investigation includes fire analysis, fire investigation methodology, fire investigation technology, evidence documentation, collection and preservation, and failure analysis and failure tools, and analytical tools. Again, so that one has 5 subcomponents. Again, section D is going to do a whole bunch more. I'm not going to read all these, but fire scene safety has those 3 components, and building system has those 4. So these are the things that you fully have to understand, and to take one out of the, let's just, fire protection systems. I mean, a fire investigator really should understand whether that fire protection system functioned as designed. And if it did function as designed, what does that mean? You know, if the fusible link was at 165 and the sprinkler head popped, at a minimum, that tells you that at the ceiling, you had 165 degrees. Does that mean something? Maybe, maybe not. But you should be able to understand and explain how a fire protection system works, why it didn't work. Maybe that's a sign of arson. If it did work, did it put the fire out, but only put it out in one area, not another? And that explains my fire effects and fire patterns. So these are the concepts that competent fire investigators should actually have to know by the end of the day. Thermometry and computer fire modeling were on the initial list in 1.3.7, and they were both taken out. That being said, they're in there. In Annex D, it does make a reference to understanding the different temperature scales. So that de facto thermometry, you know, there's 4 Fahrenheit, Celsius, Rankine, and I'm drawing a blank. Yeah, so that's the different temperature scales that you should understand. And, you know, under fire dynamics, means at which temperature can be measured. So that is thermometry in a nutshell. So it's included. It may have been taken on a name, but in the topics, it's going to be in there. So again, I've talked about Annex D, but we'll get there. We'll get there in a minute. We'll talk about that. You are to remain current in the subjects listed under requisite knowledge for 4.1.7. So you have to stay that. And again, that's where Annex D is going to come into play. You should remain current, and in the United States, you shall remain current by attending formal education courses, reading books, doing what you're doing right here, going to formalized, like the International Training Conference, going to college courses, whatever you can do to maintain and to continue your knowledge. That's how you should continue moving forward in this field. This is new. There was a lot of debate in here. So the fire investigator in the United States shall complete and document a minimum of 40 hours of continuing education. Remember, this document comes out every 5 years. So that's 8 hours a year. There was a lot of pushback. I personally, I pushed for 40 hours annually. I wanted 40 hours a year. There are some financial costs that come with that. I don't know how that's true with CFI Trainer, which is free training. That being said, I lost this argument, but we started. We've never had a minimum continuing education requirement. Now we have 40 hours. It's my hope that in 5 years and the next, it goes to 80 hours or whatever. I think we need to keep pushing this to force people. Not only do you force investigators to study, but I also think it benefits at least a public sector fire investigator to be able to go to his chief and say, look, I have to comport with this document. I have to have 8 hours of continuing education. I have to go out. And if we can get that up to 16 or 32, whatever, I think it forces the chief's hands to ensure that we have ongoing training and competent fire investigators. So I understand Lentini talked to you about OSAC, so I'm not going to go over all that. I'm going to go past this, but it's important for the following reason, and that's the only reason I touch upon it. There is a subcommittee, and it's the Fire and Explosive Investigation Subcommittee that oversees what we're doing in the United States. That's following the continuing to push our forensic science forward, hopefully. Since he kind of talked about this, if you guys want copies of this presentation, I'll give it to you after I'm done, but so you can read that. But they did recently release Strengthening Fire and Explosive Investigation in the United States, a strategic vision. It's like a 160-page document. It's free online if you wanted to copy that down, or when you get this later, you can see what that is. It's a really good document, and in there they're brutally honest about some of our strengths and a lot of our weaknesses, more so about our weaknesses in the United States, about what we do and don't do. So this is going forward. The reason I want to talk about OSAC is because of this statement here. Now, the OSAC document came out before we changed 1033, and in 1033 we now talk about Annex D, which again we'll get to. But before, we talked about the 16 topics, and they're basically saying that these topics are too sophisticated for a person that graduated from high school to fully comprehend and understand. And that one day they believe that a bachelor's in a science, I have, well, I'm fortunate enough to have a bachelor degree in science, but there's a lot of fire investigators in the country that don't have that are basic high school diploma, or maybe they have a Bachelor of Arts or something. And they're leaning toward one day where everybody will have to have a BS in a physical science or engineering. I personally don't see that coming for years, if ever, because I don't see how in the United States municipal governments will be able to say all my fire investigators are an engineer and I have to pay them that requisite, amount. I just don't see it happening. But this is the first time someone's actually put it in writing. It's been whispered about in the hallways, but now it's actually in a public report. I think it's really important it shows where the scientists believe this field should be going. So it could be a harbinger of what may be to come. And
John definitely talked about that and said that this is where it's going. So people coming into the industry got to think about the education that they're getting, and science is definitely part of it.
And John's a big push behind this. John has he's a chemist by trade, and he has a master's. So he believes that somebody with a high school education shouldn't really be rendering opinions on fires. I disagree with him a lot, but that's his opinion. But he's pushing this, and now it's in print. So I could see one day this might be it, just like he said. This could be where we're going 10 years from now. So people need to be aware that this is happening, at least in the United States. In 4.2, they talk about scene examination. There's really no changes or minimal changes between the previous document and this document. What was added was we had a lot of like look at fire patterns and evaluate the fire patterns. For some reason, some grammatical people made the suggestion that analyze is a better word than evaluate. So evaluate was stricken and analyze was added. There's a lot of that throughout the document. If you're a wordsmith, that might mean something subtle to you. I personally don't think it has that much to do with anything, much ado about nothing. But I do want to point out that has changed, because there's a lot of those changes. I don't think it's substantive. but it is in there. At least it's, something. But remember that we're talking about 921. So in section 4.2 of 1033, where your minimum qualifications are to understand how to examine a scene. Well, if you go to Nfpa 921, chapter 4, basic methodology, it walks you through the scene processing. It walks you through how to do a scene and how to do it. So 921 again is the document that tells us the how of it. In 4.2, interpret and analyze fire patterns. The highlighted stuff are the things that they change. So as you can see, if you read through it, again, I'm not going to read to you, but it's subtle. Some of the changes are subtle, but there's not really anything jumping out at you. I do think the importance is that they do reference ventilation specifically now. In this field, hopefully everybody there, I know everybody here in the stage has been beat up with ventilation, and how that affects flow path and how it affects fire patterns and radiant heat flux. So it was decided to put it actually in and start talking about ventilation and start talking about it a lot more in the documents. So I think that's where it came from. And they also talked about sequencing of patterns. So a fire effect will happen, then a second fire effect and a third fire effect. And then maybe those patterns are either obscured or overlaid by another pattern. And do you understand what those patterns are based on what your analysis is? So again, subtle changes, not really too much, but it is a change. I wanted to point it out to y'all. Interpret and analyze fire patterns. This is in the same section, but when you come down to requisite knowledge. So now they're talking about, it used to say fire dynamics and interrelationship of heat release rate, but now they're talking about including development, methods of heat transfer, compartment fire development, et cetera, et cetera. So ventilation is now mentioned again for a second time because it does play such an integral part in how fires move and create fire effects and fire patterns throughout a compartment fire at least. 4.2.6, remove fire debris, examine fire debris. They did add a little section under requisite knowledge is understanding evidence spoliation and the techniques to avoid it. They wanted to bring in, this is the private side people that wanted to bring this in, rightly so in my opinion. But if a public sector guy doesn't know what he's doing with a stovetop, well, leave the stovetop alone. Don't start opening, don't start pulling wires, because that's going to really affect potentially the private investigator behind you. So if you know what you're doing, document it and do it, because especially if you're trying to determine whether it's incendiary fire, so basically an arson or not, that's your role. But as soon as you say, okay, it's a stovetop that's accidental, you really should be stopping your work so you avoid spoliation. So they wanted to put that in there to really emphasize to the public sector people and even private sector, at some point, realize your limitations and don't be destroying or damaging evidence. And again, removing fire debris, if you go to chapter 6 of NFPA, fire effects and fire patterns, you could see where they're discussing how to interpret these fire effects and how many fire effects equal fire pattern and how they create those. So again, 921 works in tandem with 1033. 4.2.8 talks about building systems. Fire investigators should understand building systems. It used to have, excuse me, very little stuff. It really talked about the HVAC system and really compartmentalization of the building. But now they added that you need to understand fire protection, detection and suppression systems. You really need to understand electricity and fuel gas systems. Now, for each one of those, again, there's a chapter in 921 that talks specifically about those. So chapter 7, building systems, is all about building systems. Now, is it thorough enough that it can answer every question you may see at a fire scene? No. That's where you might need to go to an outside resource to understand what that specific building system is. But at least chapter 7 will give you a cursory explanation, understanding of what that building system is. Chapter 9 talks about electricity. Chapter 10 talks about fuel systems. Now realize that this is a US-based document. So I'm not really familiar with your electrical system over there, but I know the UK's is totally different than ours. So the electricity system here, where it's talking about amperage and watts, is probably going to be the same, but when it's talking about connectability, it's going to be totally different, and how our grids are set up. So remember, this is still a US-based document. Documenting the fire scene, which is in section 4.3, there's not really too many changes in there at all. It stayed pretty true. Documenting is documenting. But in concert with 921, there's a whole section of documenting the investigation under chapter 16. Evidence collection and preservation, same thing. Not too many suggestions were made on how to collect or different ways to collect evidence and preserve it. But again, in chapter 17 and 921, if you go under the physical evidence chapter, it talks about all the different myriad ways to collect evidence and document that evidence. The last section in 1033 is 4.7. And one of the things they talk about is prepare a written report. So the document used to say that the report accurately reflects the blah, blah, blah. Well, they added reflects the data or facts, data, and scientific principles on which the investigator relied, and clearly identifies and expresses the investigator's opinions and conclusions. That wasn't in there before. That goes in tandem with what OSAC is trying to do, where you're supposed to talk about every hypothesis you developed and how you refuted that hypothesis. Again, I'm a public sector guy. We write really lengthy reports. I would say our average kitchen fire is like a 12-page report, and a fatal fire is probably going to be 50 to 60 pages. That being said, we don't reference every hypothesis. We refute it. I live in Las Vegas. On the way there, I don't talk about lightning. It's August. We haven't seen a cloud in 7 months. I'm not going to have much lightning. So I don't write in my report, I don't believe there was lightning for the following reasons. So I don't, but anything that's a viable heat source in the area of origin, I will discuss that in detail as to how I ruled that out and eliminated that. And again, going back to, it's married to 921, documenting the investigation in chapter 16 talks about all that. Now we get to the big change, Annex D. And I'm going to go through Annex D, but I am not going to touch upon everything in Annex D. As you will see how detailed it gets, I could literally write a semester-long course on explaining what's in Annex D. Interesting caveat though, the document says the annex is not a part of the requirements of this NFPA document, but is included for informational purposes only. So on the one hand, it says everything we're about to talk about isn't required, but it's here for your information only. Now that's all well and good, but in the United States, you give a lawyer a list of anything, and that's what you're going to be quizzed on. So the lawyer may say, yes, or you may say as a witness, well, I don't need to understand everything in chapter 16. And he's just going to respond, well, it says the requisite knowledge you have to have is this. So explain this, explain the ideal gas law to me. And if my stance is, well, that has no bearing on this report and it's in the annex, I don't think I'm going to win that battle. I think I'm going to be eliminated as an expert. So I still think, even though it's for informational purposes only, this is now, in the United States at least, what's going to be used by the defense attorneys. But it does limit us. I mean, now there's a definitive limit on what we're going to do. But as you can see, one of these subsections has 26 further subsections underneath it where they talk about, I think it's thermodynamics. What are the 26 things you need to understand in thermodynamics? So it's pretty detailed. This annex, it says in there, provides examples of concepts and terms for evaluating requisite knowledge. And you're supposed to have an understanding of what these terms and concepts are. Not only should you have an understanding, and maybe you don't need to understand mathematically how to write the equation for instance, ideal gas law, but you should have an understanding conceptually of what that means. I mean, how does pressure and temperature relate to a gas movement within a structure? That might be important for you to know, not the actual equation itself. When you're talking about radiant heat, when you're talking about flame height calculations, if you're doing those things, it's good to know the interrelationship of it. And if you can do a flame height calculation on hand or in a computer, that's great. But I don't know if you need to know the actual mathematical equation and be able to express it, but you need to understand conceptually what that is and what that interrelationship between flame height and radiant heat flux is, in my opinion. So remember, we had these 4 topics. So it was a simple 4 in in section 4.1.7. All you got to know is these 4 things. That's all you got to know. But now look, fire chemistry has 12 subsections. Thermodynamics has 6. Fire dynamics has 26. I misspoke earlier. And explosion dynamics have 9. So these are the topics that you have to know as requisite knowledge in the United States right now. And some of these are a lot. Now, I would argue that when we break these down, and we're not going to break them down in detail, so don't get scared and run away. We're going to do this rather quickly. A lot of this is common sense. A lot of this, if you've been doing investigations for more than 3 years, a good deal of this you probably already know. For instance, the fire triangles in here. Hopefully anybody that's been doing this for more than 5 days understands a fire triangle. That being said, some of these you may not be comfortable explaining, and maybe this is where you realize maybe I have a knowledge gap, and this is where something I'm going to study on my own, or I'm going to go into 921, or I'm going to have my chapter do a class on this for the next morning, whatever you call this thing, morning meeting or whatever it was. So, and again, everything in here you can find in 921. And again, I don't want to espouse the 921 is the end all be all document. There's a lot of documents out there that have much more and probably more in-depth information related to it, but at least it's a touchstone where you can go to find this. So let's talk about fire science when we talk about fire chemistry, first of all. So states of matter. Most people know what that is, gas, liquid, solid. So boom, check that one off. But how do they interrelate? What's sublimation? What's evaporation? Do you understand that? Do you understand how things change? Maybe you want to get a little more detail. Chemical reactions, a fire triangle, fire tetrahedron. Everybody should understand that. Stoichiometry, everybody probably understands that. But what are the chemical compositions of common combustibles? Do you know what those are? Do you need to know what those are? John Lentini, if we are co-presenting right now, his famous thing is if you don't understand the chemical composition of any material, you can't say whether it's flammable or ignitable or blah, blah, blah. I disagree. Now, his background is chemistry. My background in ATF, we really focus on thermodynamics and fire dynamics. So I have a better understanding. I think it's more important to understand that. But that's just because I understand it. So it makes me feel better. They're thinking I'm smart. So just realize there's some happy medium in here in the middle of all this. Phase changes, you guys, most people understand that. Material properties. Now we're getting into stuff that you probably understand, but can you give a definition? Can you give a definition of what vapor pressure is? We may have used that term, but what is the actual definition? How does it interplay? What is melting? That's easy, okay? But can you explain it? And how did melting in this case lead you to believe that that's the origin of the fire? Effects of temperatures on property, on structural properties. So you could see how they're going, that flammable limits, minimum ignition energy. Again, the scientific explanation may be different than, I know that if a match is added to a tablecloth, it's going to catch it on fire. Well, if somebody asks me, what's the minimum ignition energy? I'm going to say, I don't really know, but I know that the flame of a match is at 1800 degrees Fahrenheit potentially, and the cloth will ignite at 450 degrees Fahrenheit. So you hold it there long enough and a match will do that. I can transfer enough energy to get to the minimum ignition energy. And I think if I'm telling that to a jury, they understand that better than if I did a mathematical equation. But you could see some of these things, ignition temperatures, heat of combustion, flash point. And you can go through all of this and develop a class, in my opinion, for what we're doing. So that's the ones under fire chemistry. Then thermodynamics. What's the different definition of energy? What is the definition of work? What is the definition of power? How do those play? Again, in the United States, if you give a defense attorney a list of questions, you better be prepared to answer them. And Nfpa just gave them a list of questions. So if I have a brain fart, I'm sitting on the witness stand and they say, Chief Heenan, can you please explain the definition of power? And I go, I could be disqualified. I don't think I would be, because I just put it in context. I may not give an actual definition. I interrelate it to how it played a role in my fire. So I think that these are the things that maybe we could start identifying as knowledge gaps, and we have to learn. So thermodynamics only had 6 of them, but fire dynamics has a lot. But again, if you look at some of this, you've already studied this. You understand the difference between smoldering and pyrolysis, I hope. So those are two you could check off pretty easy. Everybody should understand heat transfer. That should be hour one of fire investigation: conduction, convection, radiation. Those should be a non-brainer. So I think if you were to sit down and look at the 26 under fire dynamics, you're really going to say, well, I might have a knowledge gap of 7, and I got to study those 7, but I'm comfortable with the other 19. So that's, I think, the way, at least that's the way I'm recommending to our chapter, and that's the way we're doing it here in the States. Again, counter and concurrent flow, you probably know that. If you're not familiar with those terms, I guarantee you do know that. It's how flame spreads. Concurrent is, if you're holding a drape, it's moving up because of the buoyancy and the heat and preheated. Counter's going down. Everybody knows that, but now can we explain it and define that if we get asked to in the United States? So you could see all the difference in fire dynamics. There's 26 different fire subsections that you'll have to be able to at least articulate that you have a minimum understanding for. Then we go into explosion dynamics, and there's 4 subsections. So you could see how this interplays. Now, one of the things I want to bring up is that if I was a witness and I had a compartment fire and it was a room and contents fire and there was no explosion, if I got questioned as to explosion dynamics, the judge would probably say that's outside the realm of what you're doing. So not every one of your fires is going to relate to every section of Annex D, because I may not have had an explosion. So why would I have to define the definition between, or the difference between deflagration and detonation? It's going to be really up to the judge of what he or she allows in. But you can see the different things. If you ever took a post-blast course, all of these you understand, you would know. So that was just the first one under the first category. So now you go to the second category, which is fire investigation, and you can see there's another 13, 27, 30, 32, or 33 that you have to do under that. But some of these, again, how to determine the origin of a fire. That's something we should have been teaching everybody from day one, how to determine the cause of the fire. Some of these aren't definable. It's going to be the totality of your investigation. Who's responsible? We've always had to define some of these whenever we testify. So I know it's daunting when you see this list, but realize, sit down and look at this list and go, okay, I got that one, I got that one, I got that one. And I think you really realize your potential knowledge gap, at least for this list, isn't as large and as you would imagine it to be. Again, I'm not going to read all those to you. You can read. If you have any questions about what one means, I can try to answer them for you. But these are just, we wanted to outline what people in our country should have a minimum knowledge base of. One of the ones, scientific method, everybody should know that, but one of the ones we have in the United States, I don't know if it's big over there, maybe it started there, I don't know, is bias. How are we reflecting bias? How are we saying what is valid or not valid? But you could see, now some of these won't even affect you guys. Look at N, the impact of Daubert versus Merrill Dow. That's a Supreme Court decision that's vital in our country and probably has no bearing in your country. So some of this stuff, and I don't think there's many, but 1 or 2, especially on the legal side, are going to be US centric. Fire investigation technology. All they said broadly is that you have to be aware that there's constantly changing tools. One of the things they list in there is you have to understand that a shovel is a tool. You have to understand how to work a shovel. But maybe you don't have a unmanned UAS, an unmanned aircraft system. But you have to understand that maybe that's an asset you can get, or you can get a 3D laser scanner. You might not have it, but understand that those tools are out there if you really need them, that maybe you can get assistance from another department or a private company to get that. Evidence documentation, again, I would argue that these ones are the easier ones because these are the ones we've been doing years and years, and it's really not too much changing. Hopefully everybody knows how to avoid cross-contamination. Hopefully everybody knows difference about spoliation and how to package evidence. So some of these lists are going to be really, really, really easy. Failure analysis, how to prepare timelines. this may or may not be germane to your origin and cause. I always argue timeline's always germane to everything, but it might not be how you're doing. Like, look at the second one. Are you using fire models? Are you just doing a rudimentary flame height calculation on a napkin, or are you using a FDS field model? If you're using FDS field model, who wrote that code? How did you put the parameters of the absorption value of that energy into that material? How did you put the decay value? So if you're going to use something like that and want to introduce it in court, you better have a very good understanding of how you do that, how you articulate it, and how you did it. Fire scene safety is easy. Hopefully everybody does that every single day of their life. Unfortunately, I know we don't, but that's an easy, that's a layup for us. Hazard recognition, they go into identifying how to be safe on a scene, hopefully stuff you're using, how to look for hazardous materials, how to be safe, all this stuff. The final one is building systems. So your type of constructions, what is electricity, fuel gas systems, and they go into different subsections under each one of these too. So it's not enough to understand a sprinkler. What's a passive fire protection system? How does that work? How did it play a role in what you did? A lot of this, again, you may not need on every single scene. Electrical systems. How are you doing that? So these are just a list of what in the United States now we believe fire investigators have requisite knowledge. So this is kind of my final slide. Then I'll take questions, whoever has them, if they do, or most of you guys probably fell asleep or shot yourself sometime during this course. But I think Annex D is a great tool for setting up a training regiment. I think it's a great tool to identify what gaps you may have personally or what you may have as a unit or a team. And it lays out ultimately the pathway to be a good and competent investigator. If you were able to articulate and sit down and say, I can give you all 84 of these or whatever the number is, I think that proves your knowledge is pretty good on fire investigation. Now, can you take that knowledge and actually make anything of it? Well, that's the difference between being qualified and being competent, and that's another discussion for another day. So I hope that's what you're looking for. I know again, there's no videos and stuff, and I normally like to have comedy and do some dances and stuff, but it just didn't.
Especially coming from Vegas, I'm sure.
Yeah, I normally have a big headdress, and it's really nice. But
no, thanks, Dan. That was good. Very interesting because it's the smaller, less known cousin in the fire investigation industry. I think 1033, and trying to understand it is something that everyone should know about, and that's hence why I wanted to get you on here. I guess my question is, as you said, it's a great way to set up a training program, but I think, is it also a good way to set up a competency assessment, I guess, for a fire investigator to make sure you're ticking off those boxes in 1033?
Yeah, absolutely. But I think the competency, I mean, you're going to have to create like a hands-on, can you interpret fire patterns, and how do you do that? Do you have a fire pattern? You know what it means. You know how it was created, and then you have. I mean, there are ways to do it, and I think in a fire service, we don't deal with competency enough. I mean, we just figure everybody's competent, everybody's good at what they do, and we all know everybody we know is competent, and everybody else is a moron. So there's some truth somewhere in between that, and we have to figure out what's the real truth.
Yeah, certainly we get that over here where anyone can provide an opinion, and when you do a job and you give that opinion as a statement of some kind, and you sometimes won't understand how did that other person come up with their opinion. But yeah, it happens over here as well. Very good. I'm just looking at the comments in the chat. No real questions yet at the moment, but anyone wants to ask Dan a question about the presentation, feel free to unmute, and any questions out there.
And if not, my contact email is there. If you ever want to email me, they're more than welcome. I don't even pretend to have answers to half the questions you may think, but I can find somebody that does and point you in the right direction. So.
No, that's great. I mean, it's, as I said, it has changed quite a bit, as you've outlined there, between 2014 and now. And I think it does sort of provide more information, that Annex D, about what you should be knowing and what you should know and then again finding that knowledge gap, and then sort of concentrating on that. And certainly, you know, what we try and do here at New South Wales AFI is to certainly provide education sort of events where there is specialist knowledge around this. So that's certainly what you have done today, Dan. With no other questions, yeah, that's it. Thank you for your time this afternoon in Vegas and our time here in Friday morning in Australia. Dan, thank you very much. For everyone who's been on there, it will be recorded. This has been recorded. We'll be putting onto our YouTube site. But to Dan, thanks for your time and your work you're doing on the technical committee, and CFI Trainer as well, which is a really great resource for all fire investigators out there. Thanks again. We'll see you soon. Merry Christmas to everyone, our members and other members around the country, and stay safe, and we'll see you again in the new year.
All right.
Thanks, Dan.
Thanks, Dan.
Right, stop recording.